It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our dynamic keynote panel, Bridging the Gap, Youth in Transitions. Please note that the panelists' full bios are available through the conference platform for your reference. If you do have questions for the panel, please kindly type them in the Q&A box to the right of the screen, and we will try and get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A period, which is at the end of the session. I would like to start off by introducing our moderator for this session, Assistant Deputy Minister Trevor Sparrow. Trevor is the ADM within the Youth Justice Division of the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Next are our panelists. We have Adrianna Harvey, who is the Mental Health and Addiction Case Manager for the Youth Program Alpha Court, Community Mental Health and Addiction Services. We have Faith Bromby, who is a probation officer with the Youth Justice Services at Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. Next, we have Miriam Henry, who is an Assistant Crown Attorney, the Crown Lead for the Toronto Northwest Justice Centre. And last but not least, we have Philip Chuck Jr., who prefers to go by Chucky. Chucky is a Community Development Officer for the Social Development, Finance and Administration Youth Development Unit at the City of Toronto. I will now pass it over to ADM Sparrow to begin our keynote panel.
Thank you, Snehal. I appreciate the introduction and want to say thanks to the organizers of the conference for the opportunity to participate as a moderator in our panel discussion today. I also want to thank ADM Mail for her remarks setting off the session today. I think they set up the discussion we're about to have very well. So I want to say thanks for that, and hopefully we can do justice to some of those themes as we work our way through. Young people just by way of opening remarks, young people in the justice system are extremely vulnerable to violence and mental health issues, substance misuse issues, and also the care system, which could continue to put them at risk of further harm and further involvement in the criminal justice system. That increases, those risks increase among marginalized youth and who will also face systemic and structural barriers and potentially further destabilizing transitions in their lives. That's why we need to pursue an intersectional, equitable and systems-based approach to supporting our young people who transition between youth and adult mental health, child welfare, and criminal justice systems, and coordinate the different systems from whom these young people need support as they move along that journey. The Youth Justice Division's mission is to make a difference in the life of children and youth in Ontario who are at risk who are at risk of or involved in the youth justice system, and improve outcomes by supporting evidence-based programming and strong partnerships with youth families and the kind of community and government partners that you see represented on this panel and throughout the conference. Our commitment is to supporting those transitions between different services and different parts of the justice system and the different parts of the youth justice system as effectively as possible. And as ADM Mayo rightly called out, this can only be done in collaboration between different parts of the different parts of the healthcare system, different parts of the adult and youth justice systems, and with the partnership of the youth and families and communities with whom we are working to pursue those outcomes. And I think those outcomes align directly with the goals of the HSJCC network and the kinds of goals that have been laid out and are discussed at the conference thus far and for the rest of the day. I'm grateful also for, just as we transition into the discussion itself, I'm grateful for the breadth and depth and diversity of experience of the panel members, and we have a lot of experience and wisdom to draw from, and I will do my best as we work our way through the questions to steer the conversation to bring that out. In terms of the format of the conversation, we have 3 questions that we're going to work our way through. So I'll introduce the question and then do my best to steer between our panel members to share their expertise and their thoughts about the different questions that we have in pursuit of in pursuing the overall discussion. So without further ado, I think I'll just transition into doing just that. So our first question for the panel today. Sorry, before I do that, just to say that as Snehal pointed out, there will be active Q&A after the sort of the formal discussion. We'll make room for some Q&A afterwards to close. So please do pop your questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can. So first question. From your experience, esteemed panel members, what are some of the key vulnerabilities for the young people involved in the criminal justice system? I'm going to start this with Adrianna, and then we'll work our way through the other panel members for thoughts that they have to share.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to be able to speak with everyone today. As mentioned, my name is Adrianna. I'm a youth in transition case manager in Thunder Bay. I support individuals between the ages of 16 and 24, so really that crucial age of youth transitioning into their adulthood. When I think of key vulnerabilities, I think through a psychosocial rehabilitation lens, which focuses on psychological health, biological determinants, and social health as well. Some of the key vulnerabilities may extend into a youth's history, having experience with what's known as the revolving door, receiving many referrals and assessments that often don't result in effective interventions. There may be early exposure to crime, violence, or trauma, which may increase that risk of recidivism or cycle of crime involvement. We may see this if there's been family history that supports that as well. And youth may face stigma or prejudice due to some of those histories. Another key vulnerability as a case manager that I've noticed is the lack of informal supports. So having that community connection, the family connection, friends and peers that can support positive outcomes. As well as formal supports. This can be difficult to set in place due to the high wait lists, the difficulties with application processes, and all of these factors contribute to vulnerabilities for youth in the justice system, making it more and more difficult for them to reach their desired outcomes. Many youth are having their first experience with mental health or addiction challenges, and that's very difficult to manage if you don't have a primary physician or someone who can send some referrals in if you're looking into diagnoses. Another vulnerability may be over-representation in the criminal justice system of visible minorities or intersectional minorities. So we may see this with people who identify under the LGBTQ lens or as a visible minority at the same time. Some of the remaining key vulnerabilities may be not having the life skills necessary to live independent or reintegrate back into the community, dealing with isolation and loss of identity. How we can best support youth with a number of these vulnerabilities, I believe, is starting with where they are. Creating goals collaboratively that focus on that psychosocial rehabilitation, focusing on prevention and listening to who the individual is beyond the challenges and problematic behaviors that might be listed on referrals. So really finding out what is going to be helpful for them and working together on that. So some things might be early interventions, enhancing community services, so strengthening our resources and our collaboration with other services, increasing access to mental health support and decreasing the wait times, increasing connection to family, culture, informal supports, and trust overall, having a clear understanding of the legal process where you can find legal advocacy and just being informed of your rights. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Adrianna. I appreciate that. I'm gonna bounce it next to Faith to see what thoughts you might have to share on this part of the question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so as of late, I've noticed that in servicing our youth, I'm kind of seeing a big vulnerability within the whole family as a system. A lot of these youth, their behavior does not kind of occur in isolation. That I'm seeing families, and I think many POs are seeing families who there is intergenerational trauma, there's intergenerational poverty, there's intergenerational mental health, addictions, even neurodiversity. And then on top of that, when you add, you know, we have all of these concerns as a family unit that have been ongoing, and some are from systemic, and you add in a rural environment, you add in racism, you add in sexism, being seen stigmatized from a diverse community, it really starts to kind of build up. And I find that a lot of times, a lot of our youth are coming and they're not only dealing with their own mental health and addictions, but they're in a family environment where either they've been, because of the family situation, they're not living at home because it's not safe for them. They may have parents who are struggling with their own addictions and mental health that is having an impact on their mental health and addictions. Maybe they are vulnerable to people who are being brought into the home, and even parents, associates. And so I find that a lot of our times as POs are sometimes not just working with the youth, but also working with the families, trying to encourage parents to have strategies, trying to encourage broader systems to get involved with families where they are at and try to meet their needs. One thing that I kind of also see that has been occurring in the last little bit is sometimes when we even have families that are kind of well intact and are just struggling, is that we seem to have fallen away from parents even being able to speak into their children's lives and to give information because of consent. We see in the justice system that many times, not only do youth get to give their voice within a court context or with their lawyer, but parents don't get to speak either, or be able to speak to identify unless there's consent there for people to be able to speak with a parent. And that has caused great frustration that I hear from parents a lot. And a lot of parents who want to be involved in their kids' lives are feeling disempowered. And I think a lot of these things not only start before kids come into our justice system, but they needed to start in those kind of early years, because I feel like at times our justice system is really addressing mental health, poverty issues, racial issues, neurodiverse issues. And it needs to kind of start in the early ages, and we need to strengthen our communities and our systems out there to be able to meet their needs.
Thank you, Faith. I really appreciate that. Lots of really valuable insights. I'm gonna ask Chucky to share some of your thoughts about this part of the question around the vulnerabilities that our youth are facing.
Then I believe when considering vulnerabilities, there isn't much more to be said than what the other panelists have spoken on. I think really it's a matter of like simplifying it. It's looking at the idea of opening our eyes to see beyond behavior and choices, and seeing context and circumstances surrounding the youth and young people that are attributed to the behavior or the poor decision making that's happening around them, that are leading them to be involved in the justice system. And I think this is where us as I guess social service providers or facilitators within the justice system need to challenge ourselves to see the far and wide of the landscape that is vulnerability for youth or a young adult, and also stepping into the discomfort of their shoes versus the ease of labeling behavior good or bad, and just simply towing the line of pro-societal values and dues.
Thank you. I appreciate that that sort of repositioning of the conversation, and as you say, that sort of the boil down and simplification, or sort of clarification, simplification that you talk about. That's very helpful. Miriam, I'm wondering if you have thoughts to share on question number 1, or you want to proceed with the conversation. Up to you.
Thanks, Trevor. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I agree with Chucky. A lot has been said that I agree with by my panelists. I would only add this, that young people, one of the overarching issues is trauma. And trauma comes from many different sources. And as Adrianna was mentioning, intersectionality, so people can have many, many different layers of trauma. And as Faith is discussing, a lot of that is intergenerational. And so young people's behaviors are often deemed behavioral when it is actually a reflection of the trauma that they're experiencing in their at a time where their executive functioning is still under development. And so that creates vulnerabilities of how they react to that trauma, and the reactions to those issues that they're dealing with brings them into criminal justice very often. And so understanding what it is that brings young people into criminal justice is really the only way to get them back out of criminal justice.
Yeah, thank you for that. It brings together a couple of themes of what your colleagues on the panel have said, but also I love that final thought about how did they get here is a really important question. Instead of judging them for the moment at which we find them, which is something that a number of you have said. So appreciate that. Appreciate those thoughts. If nothing further from the panel, if there's nothing further, then the panel members want to jump in and sort of tack on there, I think we can move on to the next the next question. Looks good. So we're going to keep rolling. Want to talk next about what some of the key barriers are for young people accessing support. So the youth who are, once they're involved in the justice system, what are those key barriers to accessing the support that they need? And potentially also sort of key barriers for young people who have become involved in the youth justice system and are transitioning into the adult system, and what some of the key barriers that we're aware of that our young people are going to face. I'm going to start off this round with Chucky, and then we'll work our way through.
Yeah, so for the key barriers, I honestly believe that there are four key barriers to justice involved youth access and supports in the justice system. And they are a lack of knowledge of what resources, services, and supports are available to them and which are appropriate for their needs. The second one I would say again is, and it bounces back to the first point that we were discussing is circumstance and context. That no matter the efforts on the part of the youth justice system or the service provider assisting, that if the context and life circumstance of the youth isn't addressed or alleviated, their ability to properly access or take full advantage of the support will be hindered. Thirdly, I would say accountability on the part of the service provider, either the facilitator of the youth justice system in regards to whether it is the Crown, the judge, the duty counsel assisting them, or the probation officer, and mainly the accountability of the youth to follow through of their own accord. Or lastly, I would put this one really on the 12 to 17 definition of a young person in the youth justice system versus the nonprofit sector's definition of 12 to 29, 9 for youth, because I feel that sometimes this definition conflicts in how we provide services, or even in creating awareness of the services that are available, right? And when looking at, I apologize, my dog is being a little bit noisy in the background because he's asking for attention. In regards to youth transitioning from the youth justice system and into the adult justice system, I believe that there needs to be an awareness on the part on their part that where the youth justice system may have taken a less punitive and more understanding approach of their circumstances that may have contributed to the behavior or the choices that led to them being involved in the youth justice system, that the adult system is more about punitive consequence action, that there's little room for consideration of behavioral wise and poor decision making. And now, with that said, the little room does not mean that there's an opportunity to access resources, services, or supports that may assist them in their transition or entry into the adult justice system. I believe it's more just that wherein the youth justice system, the supports are readily available and offered, the adult justice system isn't necessarily holding out its hand to offer those supports, and it requires, and this isn't always negative, but consequence and legwork on the part of the young adult that's moved in, that's transitioned into the adult justice system, to look for the services and the resources and supports that they may need within their transition.
Outstanding. Thank you. Thanks, Chucky. That really lays it out. There's a couple of really, I think there's a couple of really significant threads that you've laid out to open this part of the discussion. I'm going to turn to Miriam next to ask you to share, sort of to layer on and move forward from there.
I agree with a lot of what Chucky has had to say. I think some of the significant barriers for accessing supports is not knowing what supports are out there, not understanding the criminal justice system that they find themselves in. I also agree with what Chucky was saying about, the arbitrariness between being a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old. That is what happens in criminal law, but that doesn't happen in other areas. How old are you when you're able to buy alcohol or rent a vehicle? These are arbitrary. And so we see that vulnerable 17-year-olds are just as vulnerable when they're 18. And nothing has changed other than the criminal consequences for their behaviors. And the supports and everything that's built into the YCJA is very different in the criminal code. And so that is definitely one of the barriers in one of the issues that impact emerging adults, because they're emerging adults, but we know that trauma impacts your ability to your development, your neurodevelopment. Because as you are waylaid by issues in your life that are systemic and societal, but then also might be just individual. Like, you might have a family tragedy. The person you love the most passed away, and you don't have access to counseling. And so all of that comes together and it still impacts people, and people who have those issues, regardless of how old they are. But the consequences they experience in criminal justice are very significant as adults. And so that is significantly problematic. And the agency that is required for young people and their families to take the supports that are being offered is also been touched upon by Faith's comment about intergenerational trauma. And sometimes some of the biggest struggles come from a young person and their family. So you can't really support a young person without looking at their family. You can give them as many service referrals as you want, but if they're not able to action those for whatever sets of reasons, or the people that are caring for them need supports themselves, if it isn't a holistic approach, it is not going to work. And I think for those in particular who are neurodiverse, who are racialized, the more issues that you are dealing with in your life, The more trauma you are experiencing, the longer your development in many ways in terms of managing those dynamics. Executive functioning is delayed, and that is about your impulsivity, susceptibility to peers, susceptibility to negative environments and negative neighborhood dynamics. And so all of those come together to coalesce to bring people into criminal justice and to bring young people into the adult criminal justice system. Those are barriers that we know exist about education of what's out there, and how to actually implement change for a young person in a meaningful way that doesn't set them up for failure, that works with what they have, understanding where they're coming from and going from there, and trying to assist them as they manage through criminal justice. But with a specific understanding that an 18-year-old is now dealing with the legal consequences of being an adult, but the practical realities of still being a young person, still managing their development and negotiating their experiences and trying to determine how to filter all of those experiences, racism, toxic masculinity, other issues. And it's a lot for young people. And you add other issues into that, like poverty, lack of access to their education, or an education system that doesn't speak to them, or curriculum that they don't actually understand or don't relate to. I mean, there's just so much that comes together. And so there are a multitude of barriers. So I think the first is to understand the individual and what are their particular circumstances and how do we service them. It can't be a one size fits all. That never works. Every sort of program has to have flexibility so that the individual needs can be addressed. Even co-accused with the same criminal offenses are in that particular situation for different reasons, even if their conduct in a criminal context is the same. The reasons are different, and it's for us to figure out what those reasons are. But accessing supports is particularly challenging for those who are in marginalized communities that have a lack of supports readily available and a lack of education about what supports could be accessed. And so that all comes together to coalesce to disadvantage some people more than others. There's a reason why the people that come into criminal justice tend to look the same, that there's patterns, and we can see those patterns. Those are systemic patterns in the systems that manage them, like the police and the courts, but also what's happening in community and the lack of community involvement with criminal justice. We need to embed those things together because everybody has to come together to actually help young marginalized people, or it isn't going to be effective.
Thank you, Miriam. Again, extending on some, I think what are some recurring themes here, but where you finished too, it is the whole question about the integration of the efforts of the justice system, say capital J, and the communities, right? It sort of shaping up. There's some threads in shaping up how essential that is. I want to toss it next to Faith. Just get your thoughts on this question about the barriers that the young people you're serving run into.
Thank you. I kind of see the barriers as truly kind of a level of their own level of motivation and their need to consent to services. And some of this comes out of the fact that they have teenage brains and they're still developing. And we know the teenage brains, they change their mind quickly. They can't read social cues appropriately. They don't think long term. As far as consequences, they may not be able to even articulate or have words of vocabulary to express how they're feeling. And if you add to this trauma, FASD, acquired brain injury, mental health, addictions, and then you put that in a court system where kids are they need immediate kind of response. So I committed my offense 1.5 years ago, and I'm just being consequenced now, and I forget really what I've done, and I don't fully agree to what's occurring. And I really didn't even get to say anything except my name and my date of birth, which I said every 8th court appearance. It's really challenging for these youth to come to a place where there is an immediate kind of consequence with the behavior that's occurred. And I think that delay with their brain development is a barrier. And then they come to us and we're like, well, the court says you need to do this, and the court says you must do counseling. And unfortunately, many of our services, I believe there's some really great services out there doing fantastic jobs, but they are for people who are already in the planning and action stages. So if you have a pre-contemplator or a contemplator, there is nothing naturally there for them. As POs and as people who are maybe working with them, we try to move them through the stages of change. However, it shouldn't just come within a probation office context. I would hope that these youth could be in relationships with people in the community where they can build trusting relationship with caring adults, where they can establish community supports, where they know that this is my community, so that when they're engaging in this behavior, there's someone who's to speak into it beforehand, to hopefully prevent the behavior. But I think that just doesn't happen. And then now to have a kid who needs to give consent to go into treatment, who needs to go to consent into counseling, and they don't consent, is really challenging. And parents will be saying, I need my kid to go. I'm being accountable. I'm getting the phone calls from the school. Police are coming to my house. I feel like I can't do anything because my kid's refusing to do everything. There just seems to be a lack of disconnect there in our systems. And not that we want to forcefully contain kids, but we kind of, again, sometimes dismiss that parents sometimes do know when they're directing a kid into services what their kid needs. And yet a kid can say, no, I don't think I need that. And then next week they may change their mind about that. And so I always feel like we're in this yo-yo situation a little bit. And then if we add into that, bottom line is our kids don't drive. Many of them don't drive. Many of them don't have their own finances. Sometimes there's significant wait lists when services do become available. And as soon as they turn 18, now we're throwing them into another whole system where parents don't have to be involved at all. If they did have supportive parents and the kid feels their parents are out to get them, they're like, nope, you can't speak with my parents anymore. So now you've also cut off a very good connection. Maybe that was supportive for a family, or for that youth. And then connecting to adult services for mental health, FASD, developmental services, that becomes a whole other field to navigate. So there's definitely some challenges out there. One of the great things that I love seeing at the courts is when a Section 19 conference where we just don't look at the behavior, but we get to the backstory of what's occurring with the youth, and we get to see who the supports are, because that's when some good collaborative case management can happen. And maybe a youth can see, hey, here are my supports. These people do want to help me. They're just not out to get me. And maybe that calls them into some accountability as well. But that's kind of what I see as the thing, is just the matching up of level of motivations, where services are, and something that's for those pre-contemplators within the community before they even get to the courts.
Thank you, Faith. Lots of great additions and sort of and layers added onto the conversation and the thread of where we're headed. I just want to pass it quickly to Adrianna to finish out our thoughts on this question before we move into the last question. And we have a feline panel member who clearly has things to say on the matter.
You may see me fumbling because he's just very anxious to say hello.
There you go.
Yes, great points mentioned for all the panelists. And if I can maybe build off of some of those, I definitely agree there is a lack of knowledge of resources, not only with youth, but community service providers. Myself, I oftentimes don't have the correct information because programs are changing very quickly. Funding is always allocated to certain areas and then taken out. Circumstance and context is important. We really need to look at where these youth are coming from, their backgrounds, their identity. Oftentimes they may not have even established that, or they're dealing with that identity crisis. Being more flexible with services, who we can be providing services to, when and how. The difference between 17 and 18 is 1 day. So the idea that we wake up as an 18-year-old with all the skills, tools, resources necessary to live independently is unrealistic. So from a case manager lens, I often deal with and work with youth pre and post custody. And pre-custody, I see a lot of fear when entering the justice system. Who will be there? Is it going to be a safe place for me? Will I still receive mental health support? When I leave custody, am I going to have the housing that we spent a year and a half setting up, or my financial income supports? So we're seeing high wait lists, and when youth are leaving the justice system, a lot of hopelessness around it, having those opportunities to become independent in a way that's meaningful for them. So really focusing on what do those transitions out of care and justice look like? Are we supporting continuity of care and triaging services, informing future partners of what the most helpful approaches are and what the history looks like? And when thinking of youth who may be under the LGBTQ plus or marginalized population umbrella, I also think of systemic discrimination, biases that may perpetuate discrimination based on race, ethnicity, having limited access to quality education that goes into what some of these diverse communities and populations look like, and how to keep yourself safe. Lack of representation in the justice system as well with service providers, needing more holistic cultural approaches, and just having a general sense of awareness when working with youth that there is often deep-rooted trauma and unresolved conflict. Really having that sensitive approach and approaching with compassionate curiosity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Adrianna. I like the way you sort of some of the themes that you brought us back to as we close that loop. Our last question of the formal panel discussion speaks a little bit. We've already been some comments some comments made, some threads tossed out about the way we deliver services across the various systems as being part of the picture, and so some of the challenges do exist. Because the services are available in multiple different systems that often operate perhaps in silos or not with the optimal level of connection or coordination, including health and community services and addiction services, child welfare, as well as the youth and adult criminal justice systems. So I want to talk a little bit about what the opportunities are to break down these silos and work better together, and maybe with shine a light on some of the promising steps we're taking in different parts. I'm going to start this loop with Miriam.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to be able to say that I'm the crown for the Toronto Northwest Justice Centre, and Justice Centres are a new court model in Toronto, in Ontario. And what we are doing is trying to address all of the issues that have just been raised by Chucky, Adrianna, and Faith, how to actually support people who come into criminal justice. What the Justice Centre does is take social and health services and embed it in the criminal process. Young people come into the Justice Centre, it's voluntary. They come in, they have a social worker assigned to them who does an intake with them to determine what exactly are their needs, not what their offenses are. The police tell us what that is. We don't need to know that. We need to know who they are, not what happened on a particular day in their life. And so once that information is gathered, we have in-house resources. And what we've done is we've brought resources to people. And part of that is an education about what the criminal justice system is, what's the impact of marijuana on the brain. Whatever it is, we have lots of tools and information to provide to people if they've identified as having a particular issue. Our social workers look at our internal resources. We have a dedicated psychiatrist. We have dedicated social workers and psychologists who can do immediate counseling for young people. We have education advocates who, for young people who flag with issues in education, that social worker and that lawyer go into the education domain and make sure that their needs are being met. And we have also then linked with about 70 different community agencies in the neighborhoods of the jurisdiction where young people are being arrested, and have embedded those agencies into our referral process for the exact same reasons that have been discussed here, because you need to support families, you just can't support a young person. Supports for young people need to be in place long after their criminal charges are dealt with, which is what the Justice Center provides. Supports have to be for identified needs. Everybody comes into criminal justice for a different reason. You need to figure out what that is. The Youth Criminal Justice Act tells us that we need to hold people accountable, we need to rehabilitate them, and then we need to reintegrate them. And you need to understand who they are before you can begin to rehabilitate anybody. And you can't reintegrate somebody unless they have the tools they need to be successful. So that is what we have done. We have referrals that go to their families as well. For cases resolving in the Justice Center, we have referrals for young people who are victims of crime. A lot of our young accused people have been victims of crime themselves. So we look at who they are. If they are in child welfare, we embed their case managers in child welfare and what's happening in child welfare with what we're doing, so we don't duplicate services, so that traumatized young people don't have to retell their story over and over to service providers. We provide that information to each other, and so that they don't have to keep doing that. If they're having issues in school, we have advocates that go right into that school. If it turns out that they need assessments, we can get those assessments done immediately and provide it to community members, service workers, people who can actually implement those recommendations. And so what we've done, part of the aim of Justice Centers is to take the criminal system and embed it in community, but is also to take a look at all the different things that are happening in community and in government and different systems, and bringing them all together so that those young people and their families don't have to try to navigate all these different systems, that they have information provided to them, that they can come to a Justice Center and have all of those service providers come to them and coordinate amongst themselves for a comprehensive wraparound support plan for a young person and their family that will extend long after the charges, if that is what is required. And because money is always an issue, one of the ways that we have done this is to link up with pre-existing services and supports that are in different ministries. What is happening in the Ministry of Education? What's happening in the Ministry of Health? We are all these different organizations are often dealing with the same people without speaking to each other. And those who are particularly challenged in their circumstances fall through those cracks. So Justice Centers is a place for people all to come together to collectively support young people with the individual needs that we've identified so that they can be rehabilitated and reintegrated and supported. We want to make sure, for example, if a young person is put on a probation order, that probation officer knows everything that we've done at the Justice Center, that there is a sentence review built into any finding of guilt so that that young person comes back before the Justice Center, and we can then take a look at the finding of guilt and what their record would look like, and look at closing that for record retention reasons so that they can go and get a job, and we don't have further barriers created by their involvement in criminal justice that came about because of their trauma and their own victimization. And then that ends up being their barriers for their own success going forward. So that's why we do that, to take a look to make sure that their involvement in criminal justice isn't an unnecessary barrier for them going forward. So the Justice Center is its early intervention. young people come to the Justice Center within 3 weeks of their offense date. And we've done that for the reasons that Faith talked about, because if you wait a year and a half, you got a problem, because, you know, they're a year and a half older, they're a foot taller, they've grown a beard, they're a completely different person. And everybody's talking about what they did a year and a half ago with somebody, and they barely remember that. They've moved on. So we need a faster response as a system. And we don't want young people languishing in criminal justice, because we don't want that to become their identity. So they turn to their friends and say, I'm going to go meet my probation officer. You don't want any of that. You want them to be in pro-social environments. We want to get them into pro-social programming. So we also look at their talents. What are you interested in? What part of you hasn't been nurtured? Because you can find those things in people and give them something that they're good at. That's a self-esteem issue. You have to give them agency in their own transition. And you can't tell them what to do. You need to embed them into what you're doing so that they actually follow through, because you'll end up with a probation officer or somebody who's saying to them, I don't want to, I'm not giving you consent, and it doesn't work. So it's about educating people and empowering people and their families, and recognizing where they come from, and wrapping around supports and using all the pre-existing supports that the City of Toronto has, the province has, and different sections within government, and bringing that all together. So we don't duplicate services, and we don't undo the work of other people, which happens all the time. Criminal justice court orders dismantle things that child welfare has been trying to do, etc., where everybody's ordering assessments instead of looking at each other's assessments, and re-traumatizing young people in the processes. So that's what Justice Centers aim to do, is to address a lot of the issues that have been raised by this panel, to recognize intersectionality and how that comes into how that can result in coming into conflict with the law, especially for young people in high-risk neighborhoods. You know, young people are not themselves high risk. They're vulnerable, and they're living in high-risk neighborhoods and communities, which increases their vulnerability. But they're not inherently at risk of criminal justice. That's the social lives, the social factors that are impacting their lives. And we need to find out what they are, and that's what the Justice Center aims to do. Because if you can address them, then they're more successful going forward. And that is the hope of what we're trying to do at the Justice Center. Thanks.
So wow, like thank you for that. I love the way that you're describing the work of the Justice Center sort of ties in with so many of the themes that the panel has already laid out, which is great. I see, Faith, you've been nodding your head quite vigorously as Miriam's been talking. So we're gonna go to you next to take a crack at this part of the conversation.
Miriam, I love your passion, and I'm very jealous. Because that is the work that needs to occur. I think that's really important. I think we need to do that wraparound. And we all have our expertise. Silos aren't bad if we're all still within the same community, because I think we can leverage our expertise. A teacher needs to teach. Police need to police. And sometimes we feel like we're doing other people's job because of our silos, instead of wrapping around together and leveraging our strengths and not trying to be one-man heroes. So I'm so glad that's happening. For those of us who don't have that maybe at our courthouses, I do think a big thing is what is youth? So again, there's a lot of age stages, and kind of navigating the system of what defines a youth and the age stage of that, and that impacts on consent that a youth can give to who. And it's different across the board. I mean, if you're in education, until you're 18, your parents still need to give you consent to be absent from school. But if I'm a doctor, if I feel that you have the ability to understand that, then you're covered by different legislation. Under the YCJA and the criminal code, you're governed by different legislation. And yet we know what medically a youth's brain is developed at. So I think we've gotten kind of lost over the last little bit of what defines youth, and we've broadened it and shortened it and have done a lot of things around that. So some congruency around there, I think, is helpful. I also think that more fulsome case management plans, that we are all trying to work better to improve the outcomes from our youth, and knowing how all partners are and being able to work collaboratively, I think is so important. To know this is what education is doing. And I'll be honest, sometimes even within our ministry, when youth goes into our facilities, there is a disconnect there from services that are receiving in a facility to probation to services outside. And I do think that can improve significantly. If we add to that the fact that some of our youth are very distant from their families based on where they're placed, we need to be mindful that the family, again, it is a fulsome thing. We need to incorporate those. And for those people who are in a rural community where we're in flying communities and the courthouses and the rec center, to have those collaborations between service providers, it is even things like technology that, I mean, we are coming from all over Ontario because of technology and maybe outside of Ontario. We need to provide, our province needs to provide the means so that if people cannot be in a community physically together, that they still have some virtual community and people that I have these supports. It may be access to a phone that works, that I can call someone if I need it. Yeah, I think that those are kind of the big things where I stand out, and it is just about collaboration, and where collaboration can't occur, then again, within the court system, those conferences, Section 19 conferences, are sometimes really invaluable to bring partners together immediately, effectively. And I've seen when I've experienced those and I've been part of them, that it goes really quicker through the court system. Things are dealt with, things are in place, outcomes are better. And I see that when I've been participating in Indigenous people courts, when they are in that justice circle and people are just speaking, and everyone has an opportunity to speak and share their story, and everyone gets to talk into it and be part of the community, that is so effective and healing. And I would love to see that in every court system, to be honest with you. I think we just need to do court a little bit differently and criminal justice a little bit differently. And one thing I just want to throw out there, just as an aside too, is even within our courts, right now, I feel that for youth that I see is the addiction issue in kids who are overdosing is so much higher. And I'm sure it happens in the adult world as well. And here we have individuals in our facilities on bail for long periods of time. They're withdrawing there, they may not be getting their medications, and we have just lowered their drug tolerance. And then they come out, and for many of them who don't still have the skill sets, the first thing that they're doing is going to look for to use. And I wish that we would just have a place within all of our courts where there is the ability for them to access Narcan. I just want to throw that in there because lately I've had so many kids who are overdosing within days of coming out of custody before they get to see me or get to their other service. So I just want to put that as a prop in if that can happen. So, because I just want clients to work with and I don't want them dead. So I'll throw that out there. Thanks.
On the nose, but I think we're all on the same side on where you finished there. We are a little squishy for time, but we're gonna close the loop and hopefully have a little time to squeeze in some questions from the audience group if there are any. So I'm going to toss this one to Adrianna first, and then to Chucky.
Thank you. Very great points made by both Miriam and Faith. I agree to touch on Faith's point. When youth are leaving justice, they may not have supports in place necessary to promote those positive outcomes. So really looking into those aftercare programs, maintenance, and ensuring that transition is a healthy one for them. When I think of breaking down the silos, interagency coordination and collaboration comes to mind. Agencies and organizations collaborating with one another and sharing their understanding of goals and challenges, really honing in on what that looks like. Integrated service models, so addressing various aspects of someone's life at the same time, having education in place, housing in place, and having a plan for that when youth are leaving custody. Considering youth as special priority for housing, I think that would be a great initiative, and creating safe places for transitional aged youth, specifically in terms of housing, and housing that is inclusive to LGBTQ+ and marginalized populations. Really looking at our information sharing protocols and seeing if there's a way to integrate technology and having a shared platform or database that is only for professionals involved in the immediate care of someone. And really just looking at those community partnerships. I think everyone did a great job at speaking to the rest. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrianna. Chucky?
Yes. I think a lot of like what I wanted to touch on has already kind of been said. I think the one thing that was missed is intentionality, right? In the sense of like us being very intentional of where we're referring young people to and how we refer to young people to those services, supports, and resources. And I think whether it is as a social service provider or a facilitator within the justice system, we have to be the ones to get our feet wet and do the networking and know what's out there or to support our young people, right? And then once we know what's out there and we're making that referral, it can't just simply be a referral through an email or a phone call. Sometimes we have to be, sorry about my dog in the background.
It's all good.
We have to be the one to actually like take them by the hand and do a warm transfer or a referral. Do that client accompaniment, because sometimes just to get them from point A to point B, it may seem like it's a short walk, but to that young person, that could be a very large crack in the ground beneath their feet that they feel they can't jump over, right? So I think we have to be very intentional with what that looks like, and in the sense of like collaboration and access to services, how would I put this? We can't take no for an answer when supporting a young person, when we want to connect them to a service, right? We might have one provider that might tell us no, but guaranteed there's probably going to be two others that may not have the brand that the one that we went to has, but they're willing to do that work and they're willing to work alongside the young person. We have to look beyond sometimes the policies of where we work and kind of push against them because the work that we do, it has to be fluid, like the young people we're supporting. If we're looking to create transformation in the lives of the young people that we're supporting and get them on a path of success and get them out of the system, I think we as social service providers and justice system facilitators, we also have to learn how to be fluid, bendable, and we have to be transformative, especially when we are talking about transforming the system to accommodate real change and collaboration.
Outstanding. I love the themes of being intentional and of being persistent, right? Like just and hopefully we can also arrange the services so that we don't, perhaps doesn't require as much persistence, to find the right thing for the young people we're serving. Appreciate that, Chucky, and all of you. Something perhaps somewhere, in some ways more hopeful, but also it's a hopeful part of the conversation, but also really underlining just how critical the challenge is. So this is the part, and I know we're a few minutes into the break, and we're trying to sort of stay as close to the agenda as we can given the late start, but wanted to toss out, just wanted to respond to a couple of the questions that we have from the group. The first one, and I'll paraphrase, it's been voted up, is there's a lot of interest in trauma informed approaches, and a couple, if we can share a couple of examples of what trauma informed approaches actually look like in practice in the justice system right now, and what they might look like given some of the things that are being pursued. Literally anybody who any panel member who wants to take a quick crack at that would be happy to hear it.
I think having a trauma-informed approach is understanding where the youth is currently. If there is a breakdown in a relationship, mistrust with people of authority, perhaps easily to become agitated, difficulties with emotion regulation, life skills, feeling confident in their ability to achieve things, having that understanding that these could be a result of trauma, and approaching an individual with compassion, curiosity, identifying yourself as a safe person, being non-judgmental to who they are or who they're presenting to be, and understanding that that's usually a result of that trauma and they may be in a survival mode. So trauma-informed approach really looks like meeting a client where they are and being understanding to that.
And I would just add, just on a slightly different note, from a criminal justice perspective, it's also recognizing the kind of charges that people who are traumatized commit. So what does PTSD, for example, do? It means, for example, two kids go into a store, they get caught stealing, and security touches them both and says, that's it, hand on the shoulder, you're being arrested. One sits down and waits for the police. The other completely emotionally deregulates, throws things around, assaults the security officer, damages property, and leaves with 7 or 8 criminal charges that their co-accused does not have because of their reaction. Why? Because potentially they're a victim of some sort of personal injury offense themselves, and being touched is a trigger, for example. So trauma can impact the kind of criminal offenses that you commit. Or if, for example, if you don't have a family and you keep, your family becomes your gang colleagues, or your friends are incredibly important to you because you don't have anybody in your life you trust. So you keep breaching your bail by hanging out with that one person you're not supposed to. Kids do this all the time. Keep running back to that same person and get charged over and over again. Sometimes you need to look and say, is that the only person that loves them? Is that the only person they love? Why does this keep happening? Do they not have anybody else? And that's also a trauma-informed approach, is understanding how that relates to the criminal charges they end up facing.
Yeah, excellent point, Miriam. Thank you. Chucky or Faith, just on this one before, and or Faith.
Yeah, so I was going to say, and something about trauma-informed approach too is we as service providers need to make that we are not placing our own trauma. We have suffered vicarious trauma from reading police occurrence report, from interacting, and we need to make sure that we are doing self-care, and that we are in a good place so that when we're interacting with these youth, we are not having our own transference or counter-transference, and that we are able to be effective. And I know in a age and age where we're kind of feeling and coming out of COVID, sometimes a little bit burnout, getting back into the swing of things, we need to be mindful of that. And I think our systems do as well, so that we can be the best employees and best service providers that we can be.
Yeah, excellent point. One of our past deputies in our ministry used to just gently remind that when we understand that the people we're serving across the services in our ministry are many of whom, perhaps most of whom, are experiencing or have experienced trauma, we need to be careful that the way that we approach trying to help them doesn't actually re-traumatize them, right? It's an interesting point. I'm going to close this one with Chucky. If you've got anything to add around that question around trauma-informed approaches.
Not really on that much that hasn't already been said. I think a lot of the approach for working with youth from a trauma-informed lens is really about being relational. But again, sort of to build off of what Faith said, is understanding what that relationship looks like and being relational to the young person that we're supporting, and not, I guess, vicariously putting our own experiences with trauma onto the young person or taking on their trauma, right? It's being aware of what creating that safe space looks like for them to, how would I put it? go through the motions of their trauma and how they process it, right? And I know sometimes when we are working with them from, let's say, a justice system approach, because they are in the system, and sometimes our approach has to be very dated because it's time sensitive to match up with their court dates and stuff. So if it's trying to argue on their behalf, have to, or advocate on their behalf, have in recognition of their trauma and the processes that they have to go through to not necessarily address the trauma that they have in their life, because I think sometimes trauma is something that you don't just get over, right? But to get them to a point where there's functionality in their lives, where they're able to get from point A to B to C without their trauma being at the forefront of the decisions that they're making.
Gotcha. Thank you for that, Chucky. I think we're gonna close there, just in the interest of time and where we are, you know, in respect of the agenda of the overall conference. I just want to, I'm going to keep my remarks really short, but I just wanted to start by thanking the panel members for the way that you brought all of the variety and depth of experience that you have on different perspectives on how this works and doesn't, to the table for a really thoughtful and informative and educational conversation about this. You know, I've learned a lot. I've got pages of notes, so I want to thank you all for that. And also I want to thank the participating pets of the panel members who each made their own unique contributions. And just, you know, I think just if I can highlight a couple of themes that really seem to come to the front. One is that this is, you know, the how essential it is that we are working with a whole person in the context of what brought them to us, rather than defining them as the charges that they carry, or decisions they made, you know, perhaps the you know, the least effective decisions that they've ever made, right? Which others have said they probably don't even really remember how they made them, given how long it can take to get through this. So really treating that whole person, listening past their charges or their deficits, or however our systems define them, into figuring out who they are. And then the absolute critical importance of finding different ways where we can connect up the different things available for the young people we're supporting, and for ourselves and each other as people who are doing this work. Everything we can do in that space, you know, can only contribute and make it more likely that we're going to achieve the outcomes that we're pursuing. So I want to thank all of you for the thoughts you brought to the table, and the way that you've worked together to round out the picture of the answers to each of these questions, and the time that you've spent with us, and the audience for your contributions and your attention as well. And then I'm going to pass it back to Snehal.
Thank you so much, Adrianna Sparrow. I wanted to also just take an opportunity to echo our thanks to the audience for all of your great questions. As Adrianna Sparrow said, it has been very informative and an engaging discussion. Apologies that we had to eat some of the time of our health break, but I also wanted to just thank our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. Of course, thank you to Adrianna Sparrow as our moderator. We look forward to hearing more from your ministry and upcoming work, and identifying ways that we can continue to improve our communication and collaboration within our network.